I had spent most of my career moving through the Appalachian tunnels, tracing the veins of abandoned transport lines and measuring the contours of stone that had long since stopped caring whether anyone walked them. My job was precision. Tape measures, laser rangefinders, and notebooks filled with meticulous coordinates from previous surveys. Every measurement mattered. Every beam, every rail, every intersection was logged, verified, and double-checked. Years of practice had taught me to notice the subtle shifts that indicated weakness in the rock or misalignment in the structure. There was comfort in these routines, in the order that human hands had imposed upon the mountain. Before we go any deeper, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from, and whether you've ever heard anything like this yourself. Hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks. Today, my team consisted of 3 others. The site's supervisor, a man whose authority was forged in decades of overseeing these tunnels, maintained a quiet insistence on following the schedule. He moved with certainty, but his gaze often lingered on details that might escape someone less experienced. The young technician shadowed my every step, recording measurements and occasionally pointing out inconsistencies, though he was careful not to question my judgment. The contractor, skeptical by nature, approached every anomaly with a dismissive shrug, attributing deviations to the age of the structure or the fallibility of instruments. They were competent, professional, reliable, but the work, as always, was mine to oversee. The tunnels themselves were narrow, with walls carved from a mix of sandstone and shale, worn smooth in some places, jagged and uneven in others. The air was thick with dampness, earthy and metallic at once, carrying the faint but persistent scent of rusted iron from old rails. Our footsteps echoed along the stone corridors, a rhythm both familiar and hollow. The light from our portable lamps fell unevenly across surfaces, leaving shadows that seemed to pool in corners and crevices. Each tunnel had its own character, its own subtle quirks, and I moved through them like someone reading a familiar book. We paused at a junction where the tunnel split into 2 older branches. I consulted the map, tracing the routes carefully with my finger. I noted the angles, the distances, and the approximate gradient. The measurements aligned with my expectations, though the dim lighting made it necessary to double-check each reading. The young technician leaned over my shoulder, pointing out a faint crack along the ceiling. "Does that look significant?" he asked. I examined it briefly. The fissure was minor, probably the result of decades of stress in the rock. I recorded it nonetheless. Every detail mattered, even the ones that seemed insignificant. As we continued deeper, the sense of enclosure grew. The air felt heavier here, carrying moisture that condensed on our gear and dripped onto the worn stone floor. The metallic tang of iron became stronger, mingled with the faint scent of clay and old timber. Each step required attention. The uneven floor made missteps easy. I measured every span between support beams, checked the alignment of the rails, and noted variations in the floor gradient. Nothing was irregular enough to raise concern, yet the familiarity of the space was beginning to feel slightly off. Subtle, almost imperceptible. At one point, the site's supervisor murmured something that drew my attention. Almost a whisper meant more for himself than for us. "People here always said," he said, "that the mountains watch whoever walks these tunnels." He did not elaborate, did not glance at me for reaction. It was a throwaway line, delivered as if commenting on the dust in the air or the cold of the stone. I filed it away in the corner of my mind. In my work, observations were measured in inches, in degrees, in the careful recording of every fixed point. Folklore had its place in stories, not in my calculations. Yet the words lingered, not as a threat or a superstition, but as a faint echo, a reminder that these mountains carried the weight of human history in ways I could not fully quantify. We moved on, noting every junction, every rail tie, every support. I recorded the distances meticulously, comparing them to the faded maps and prior surveys. The young technician occasionally whispered questions about discrepancies, but nothing seemed significant. The contractor dismissed the minor variations, emphasizing the age of the wood and the natural settling of stone over decades. My notes were detailed, precise, unflinching. The tunnels themselves felt ancient but disciplined, as though they had grown rigid through years of labor and oversight. They were familiar, predictable, and yet in some way, always just beyond complete comprehension. By the time we reached the midpoint of the main branch, I had logged dozens of points, noted minor cracks, uneven gradients, and slight shifts in the alignment of the rails. The work was exhausting but methodical. Each detail reinforced the sense of order I relied upon, the precision that defined my career. The young technician paused to wipe his brow, muttering about the smell of damp stone. I glanced at him briefly, reminded that each of us perceived the space slightly differently, even within the same measurements. Still, nothing contradicted the maps. Nothing defied expectation. Yet the supervisor's earlier comment, delivered casually, lingered again in my thoughts. Not as a warning, not as a superstition, but as a note of human perspective layered over stone and iron. The mountains, the tunnels, the rails they remembered. Not consciously, of course, but the weight of history in every worn surface, every subtle shift, made it impossible to ignore the sense that the space carried more than mere geometry. I recorded my thoughts sparingly, noting only what could be measured and verified, but the shadow of that casual remark persisted, like an echo in a long corridor. By the end of the day, we had completed the first major section of the tunnel system. I reviewed my notes carefully, double-checked every measurement, and ensured all points aligned as closely as possible with the archival maps. The young technician looked exhausted but satisfied with the data. The contractor grumbled something about old tunnels being predictable in their own unpredictable ways. The supervisor nodded quietly, his focus shifting to the next section. And though we had followed every procedure, logged every detail, and maintained professional rigor throughout, the thought of the mountains watching, embedded in local lore, half dismissed but lingering, remained at the edges of my mind. The routine was intact. The work was solid. And yet, as we prepared to descend into the next branch, I could not fully shake the feeling that I had stepped into a space that remembered more than I could measure, a space that had observed countless others before me and would continue to do so long after we left. The following morning, we returned to the tunnels. The light from our lamps cut through the damp darkness, highlighting the grain of the stone walls and the uneven texture of the floor. I had reviewed the previous day's measurements before leaving the site and double-checked my notes. Everything seemed consistent, and yet I carried a quiet awareness of the supervisor's remark about the mountains watching. Not as a superstition, but as a reminder that these tunnels had been walked, altered, and abandoned countless times, each passage bearing the weight of human history. Our work for the day focused on one of the older branches that had not been used regularly for decades. The maps indicated a relatively straightforward path, a series of gentle curves and slight inclines, punctuated by support beams and occasional side passages that were long since sealed. I moved through it slowly, marking each reference point with a laser rangefinder, logging every measurement with the same care I always applied. The young technician followed, recording everything in meticulous detail, his pen moving constantly across the notebook pages. The contractor lagged slightly behind, mumbling about how the tunnels always seemed predictable until they weren't. The first anomaly appeared subtly. A span of tunnel that should have measured just over 12 meters registered slightly longer by a few centimeters. I paused, recalibrated the instrument, and measured again. The second reading confirmed the first. Minor, easily dismissed, perhaps a result of settling in the rock or an imperceptible shift in the floor. I noted it in my notebook, but moved on, telling myself that these things were expected in structures of this age. As we progressed, the anomaly repeated, though not consistently. At times, spans were shorter than expected, at other times, slightly longer. Each deviation was small, a few centimeters at most, but the pattern was there, subtle and insistent. I discussed it briefly with the young technician. He suggested that we might be misreading the maps, or that the calibration of the laser rangefinder was off. I ran another check. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The contractor dismissed the discrepancies as trivial. I did not argue. At this stage, these small variations could still be explained, rationalized. They had not yet demanded attention beyond routine verification. Despite the apparent ordinariness, I became conscious of the tunnels themselves. Certain sections felt marginally different than I remembered. A bend that should have led directly to a side passage seemed slightly elongated. a junction I had measured the day before felt narrower. I walked these areas deliberately, checking my instruments and confirming each measurement multiple times. Everything remained within tolerances, yet something in the rhythm of the space had shifted. The tunnels were not hostile, not overtly altered, but they had begun to assert a subtle, almost imperceptible presence. During a pause at a particularly low-ceilinged section, the young technician commented on the shadows along the walls. "They look like they're moving," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I glanced at the uneven stone surfaces, noting how light from our lamps created shapes that changed with every step. It was nothing unusual. I had seen such effects countless times. Still, the observation made me momentarily aware of my own movement in relation to the structure, of the way the stone responded to human presence, however passively. The supervisor, walking ahead, said nothing about the deviations, but his eyes lingered on the walls and floor with the same attention I did. There was a quiet understanding between us, professional and unspoken, that some aspects of these tunnels could not be fully captured in maps or measurement logs. He did not mention the anomalies, and I did not volunteer their existence. Our focus remained on completing the scheduled survey, recording each detail as though nothing were amiss. As we moved deeper, the slight variations persisted. Spans measured consistently off by a few centimeters, bends appearing marginally longer, intersections subtly misaligned. I double-checked my notes, compared them to the maps, and recalibrated the instruments. Each verification confirmed the anomaly, yet each remained within a range that could, technically, be explained. The tension was not fear, but awareness. The space had begun to assert itself, not in opposition, but in subtle insistence, and I could not ignore it entirely. I thought again of the phrase the supervisor had muttered the day before, that the mountains watch those who walk these tunnels. At the time, it was a casual remark, almost humorous in its delivery. Now, as I traced each deviation, the words resonated differently. Not as a warning, not as folklore made real, but as a reflection of the awareness embedded in the space itself. The subtle insistence of the tunnels on being noted, measured, and acknowledged. I did not believe in supernatural oversight, but the phrase took on a new texture, a faint echo in the patterns of the structure. By the end of the day, we had completed the branch, recording all measurements and noting each deviation, no matter how minor. The young technician looked fatigued but focused, the contractor indifferent yet present, and the supervisor quiet, methodical, as always. I compiled the data, reviewing each point, and the minor anomalies formed a pattern that I could not yet interpret. They were insignificant individually, but collectively they hinted at something more, a subtle imperfection in the order I had expected. Not threatening, not conscious, but persistent. The return to the main junction was uneventful in terms of work, yet the anomalies left an impression. I recorded every measurement again, double-checked the logs, and noted the slight variations with care. My routine was unchanged, yet the space had shifted imperceptibly. The tunnels were no longer merely a series of lines and beams to be measured. They had begun to assert themselves, quietly, persistently, in a way that could not be fully accounted for. And although the deviations were small, easily rationalized, they left a lingering awareness that the tunnels, in some way, were not simply inert stone, but a space that responded, that remembered, and that observed in the faintest of measures. By the third day, the anomalies had begun to assert a subtle rhythm. Walking through the older sections of the tunnels, I noticed that some of the spans I had measured previously appeared slightly altered. A corridor that had registered 12 meters on Monday now measured 12 and a half. A junction that had seemed narrow now opened a fraction wider. Each variation was small, imperceptible to anyone without instruments, yet consistent enough to form a pattern. I could not explain it, and I was careful not to draw conclusions, only to record. The young technician, now accustomed to my pace and methodology, began noting these deviations with quiet curiosity. "It's like the tunnels are aware," he murmured one afternoon, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. I glanced at him but did not respond. Awareness was a convenient word, but it carried implications I would not entertain. I reminded myself that stone shifts, timber warps, metal expands and contracts. That alone could account for the variations. Still, the pattern persisted, emerging not in random error, but in subtle, repeated deviations. I began comparing the deviations across multiple routes, lining up measurements from adjacent branches, mapping them in my notebook in a methodical grid. Some spans were consistently longer than expected, others shorter. The discrepancies seemed to synchronize with certain bends, with the placement of support beams, even with the intervals between side passages. Each measurement confirmed the pattern, yet none suggested danger or malfunction. The tunnels were not hostile. They were merely insisting on recognition. It was during one of these detailed comparisons that the supervisor's remark from the first day returned to my attention. "The mountains watch whoever walks these tunnels," he had said. I had dismissed it as folklore then, yet now, as I traced deviations through multiple branches, the words resonated differently. Not as a literal observation, but as an analogy to what I was recording. The space itself, shaped and worn over decades, seemed to respond to attention. The deviations followed me in the notes, repeating just enough to be noticed, changing subtly as if the tunnels themselves acknowledged my measurements. The young technician asked again about the shadows, the distortions of light along the walls, the minor irregularities in texture. I noted them clinically, reminding him that uneven surfaces, the placement of support beams, and imperfect lamp lighting would create all manner of effects. Still, the repetition of small anomalies, their subtle synchronization with structural features, could not be entirely dismissed. I recorded the observations, double-checked the measurements, and continued forward. The contractor grumbled about excessive caution, suggesting that we were seeing patterns where none existed. I allowed him his skepticism. It was familiar, professional, expected. I did not argue, only maintained meticulous documentation. Every measurement, every minor deviation was logged. Every point was confirmed, remeasured, and compared. The pattern formed quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the rhythm of breathing within the stone itself. Certain branches began to feel marginally longer than I remembered, turns more gradual, distances between intersections subtly altered. I stopped measuring obsessively for a moment and walked the corridors, allowing my mind to register the differences. They were small, almost negligible, but consistent. Each tunnel had begun to assert its own rhythm, responding to observation in ways I could not quantify. The changes were not threatening. They were not aggressive. They simply existed, persistent and subtle, noticeable only because I had been meticulous enough to document them. I recalled again the phrase about the mountains watching, not as superstition, not as a literal entity, but as a reflection of what I was now witnessing, a space shaped by history, human intervention, and time itself responding to careful attention. It was a realization that came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it altered my perception of the tunnels. I did not imagine them moving or changing consciously. I noted deviations, patterns, anomalies, and my experience of them shifted without drama or fear. By the end of the day, I had compiled a full grid of measurements, confirming that deviations were not random. Spans were longer, shorter, or unchanged depending on the path taken, creating a subtle, emergent rhythm throughout the older sections. The young technician noted the alignment in his own words, hesitating before using the phrase we had now adopted privately, like the watchers. I acknowledged it with a nod, careful not to validate the superstition, but recognizing its utility as shorthand for the emerging pattern. The supervisor remained focused on schedules, the contractor indifferent, and yet the subtle impression of awareness persisted, embedded in the measurements and in my perception. Returning to the junction for the evening review, I documented every deviation, every measurement, every small irregularity. The data formed a map of imperceptible shifts, a network of subtle anomalies that repeated just enough to be noticeable, but not enough to alarm. The tunnels themselves remained unchanged in any physical sense, yet my understanding of them had shifted. Patterns were forming, small, precise, and patient, insisting on being observed. The space was no longer merely inert rock and wood. It had begun to assert itself in the most understated of ways. By the fourth day, the subtle patterns had begun to demand attention. I had become increasingly aware of minor shifts that could no longer be attributed solely to equipment error or natural settling. In one of the side passages, a beam that I had measured the previous day seemed slightly tilted, not enough to suggest imminent failure, but enough to register as an anomaly. I ran multiple measurements, cross-referenced with adjacent beams, and found the deviation consistent. It was physical evidence that the space itself was not entirely inert. The young technician was growing more observant. He noticed the faint scraping sound that sometimes echoed through the tunnels, almost as if something moved just beyond the range of light. We attributed it first to settling rock, or perhaps a small rodent, but the sound repeated in multiple locations, always in slight response to our movements. It was never loud, never aggressive, but it forced us to slow our pace to remain attentive. The contractor shrugged it off, muttering about the acoustics of old tunnels, but the pattern was undeniable. I began to document the auditory anomalies with the same rigor as the measurements. Spans of tunnels that deviated structurally often coincided with faint echoes or shifts in sound. Light played differently along the surfaces, creating brief distortions that were difficult to capture with instruments, but noticeable to the eye. Even air felt subtly different in certain sections, cooler, heavier, or moving slightly against our direction of travel. It was not threatening. It was merely present, tangible in a way that demanded recognition. One particular junction emphasized the effect. The corridor split into 3 branches, each mapped precisely in my records. As I entered the central branch, a faint vibration underfoot suggested movement in the stone itself, subtle enough that I questioned my instruments, then my perception. The young technician paused beside me, frowning. He had felt it too. We double-checked the readings, nothing abnormal in pressure, nothing in the instruments. And yet the sensation persisted. The space responded to our attention, almost as if acknowledging that we were measuring, observing, noting. I found myself comparing notes more frequently with the supervisor, whose years of experience gave him an intuitive sense of structural stability. He had not dismissed my observations, but had also not commented overtly on the anomalies. Instead, he maintained a quiet professional distance, focusing on the work while his eyes occasionally lingered on areas that had shown irregularities in previous measurements. I realized that our collective attention, professional as it was, seemed to interact with the environment in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. As we progressed, the deviations multiplied, though still small. Rails shifted by millimeters, beams leaned fractionally, side passages appeared marginally longer than mapped. Faint echoes followed us differently depending on which corridor we chose, creating a subtle awareness of the tunnel's responsiveness. The young technician whispered the shorthand we now used. "Watchers." I nodded, recording the term in my notebook without comment, aware that it was shorthand for the emerging, inexplicable pattern rather than a literal entity. By mid-afternoon, the confirmation of presence became more tactile. A damp patch on the floor, previously unnoticed, seemed to respond to footsteps, slightly cooler when we paused, slightly warmer when we passed. Tiny scratches on a wooden support beam were oriented in a way that did not match any known equipment movement or procedure. I photographed, documented, and logged them meticulously. They were not threatening, not aggressive, merely evidence that the tunnel's environment had begun to assert itself beyond simple measurement. The supervisor and contractor noticed the changes, though neither reacted with alarm. The young technician's curiosity was evident, though he remained disciplined, recording each anomaly carefully. I began to recognize that the space was forcing behavioral adjustments. We moved more slowly, double-checked measurements, paused more often, and maintained heightened attention. The tunnels were not hostile, but our experience of them was subtly altered by their responses. Returning to the main junction at the end of the day, I reviewed every measurement, sound, and observation. Patterns had emerged, confirming that the anomalies were real, consistent, and interactive. The deviations were slight but undeniable. The tunnels were asserting themselves, not in aggression, but in insistence, demanding recognition through repeated, tangible evidence. The subtle awareness of the watchers, hinted at in local legend, no longer felt entirely metaphorical. It had begun to manifest in measurable, observable ways. I left the tunnels that evening aware that the space had changed my perception. The physical evidence, the shifted beams, the altered spans, the faint vibrations and sounds, confirmed that something beyond ordinary measurement was present. Not a being in any conventional sense, but a persistent awareness that responded to attention. The pattern had moved beyond mere anomaly. It had become tangible, undeniable, and entirely without explanation. By the fifth day, our interaction with the tunnels had shifted from passive observation to cautious adaptation. The minor deviations had grown more consistent, no longer sporadic or dismissible. The beams, spans, and side passages had developed their own subtle rhythm, one that seemed to respond to our movement, attention, and choice of route. Every step, every adjustment of equipment, even a hesitation to consult the maps, felt acknowledged by the space itself. The young technician began to anticipate the changes, noting them before I could measure. "It's like the tunnels are guiding us," he said quietly, aware that his words skirted superstition. I did not respond. Guidance implied intention, and intention implied consciousness. Neither was something I could claim with evidence. Yet the effect was undeniable. Routes I expected to follow as mapped were subtly altered. Corners slightly longer, intersections narrower, distances fractionally shifted. The tunnels demanded that we adjust, and we did. The supervisor remained quiet, observing the subtle responses of the structure. His decades of experience allowed him to notice changes before instruments could register them. A support beam that had appeared stable yesterday now leaned imperceptibly when he stepped near. A section of floor shifted minutely beneath my boots, not enough to compromise safety, but enough to make careful pacing necessary. The contractor grumbled, impatient, yet even he slowed his steps, adjusting subconsciously to the imperceptible responses of the environment. One corridor offered the clearest example of active coexistence. We planned to take a side passage to verify a previously mapped junction. As we approached, the span of the corridor seemed to stretch slightly, longer than I remembered. The young technician paused. The supervisor noted the slight curvature in the ceiling, and I instinctively adjusted my path, altering the angle of approach. The corridor returned to its mapped proportions once we had changed our alignment. It was subtle, a minor correction that could easily be rationalized, yet it was consistent with previous occurrences. The space reacted to our attention and movement. Over the course of the day, these interactions became routine. The tunnels no longer felt passive. They responded to our presence in ways that required adaptation, without ever threatening or obstructing. Decisions we made about route, pacing, or placement of equipment influenced the structural feel of the space. Even minor deviations in step timing or hesitation to observe a junction caused perceptible changes. The watchers, as we had come to refer to the subtle awareness within the tunnels, were patient and deliberate, their influence manifesting through environmental feedback rather than aggression. Sounds and vibrations, previously occasional and subtle, began to synchronize with our actions. A soft scraping beneath foot followed hesitation at a junction. A distant echo corresponded to a shift in our route choice. Temperature and airflow, barely noticeable, responded in similar ways. Cooler air when we slowed, warmer currents as we advanced. None of these responses posed danger, yet collectively they required constant attention. The environment had become an active participant in our work, coexisting with us in a careful, responsive manner. By mid-afternoon, the young technician stopped questioning the anomalies aloud. He recorded them silently, noting subtle interactions with maps and instruments. The supervisor's professional distance remained, yet his body language betrayed awareness of the same adjustments I felt. The contractor, frustrated but obedient to procedure, followed our path with unconscious caution. I realized that the tunnels had established a rhythm, and we had adapted to it. Every step, every measurement, every choice of direction had consequences within the space. The effect was cumulative. Areas we had passed through repeatedly began to remember our prior presence. Deviations became more predictable, yet still required active adaptation. I paused at a junction where a small beam protruded at a slight angle, previously unnoticed. The moment I adjusted my path to avoid it, the adjacent floor shifted subtly beneath foot. It was not threatening, not deliberate in a human sense, but a gentle insistence that we account for the space itself and our movements. The watchers, patient as the mountains themselves, observed without confrontation. By evening, our data confirmed a new pattern: active coexistence. The tunnels no longer existed as inert stone, wood, and metal. They were responsive, interactive, a space that required engagement rather than mere measurement. We had become participants in their rhythm, and our professional expertise now included awareness of the environmental feedback as part of the procedure. Even the smallest decision influenced the course of the survey, the perception of space, and the subtle, persistent impression of observation. Returning to the main junction, I logged the final measurements and anomalies for the day. The young technician glanced at me, using the shorthand term once more. "They're aware, aren't they?" I simply nodded, recording the note without comment. The supervisor had already begun planning the next route, acknowledging the subtle demands of the tunnels without overtly acknowledging their presence. The contractor remained skeptical, yet his movements, slowed and adjusted, suggested he too had registered the responsive pattern. I left the tunnels that evening with a heightened awareness. The minor anomalies, vibrations, shifts, and echoes had coalesced into a single impression. We were not merely walking through the space, we were interacting with it. The watchers, patient and unobserved, had established coexistence without confrontation. I understood now that our continued presence, attention, and adaptation had created a subtle connection. There was no attack, no threat, no revelation. Only the awareness that the space had begun to shape our experience as surely as we had documented it. The last day of our survey was quiet, subdued, yet the tunnels had acquired a presence all their own. Every beam, floorboard, and passageway had left its mark on our perception. We moved with deliberate caution, aware that even the smallest action might elicit a response, however subtle, from the space around us. The young technician walked silently, instruments in hand, noting the minor deviations without commentary. The supervisor followed with calm precision, his experience allowing him to maintain composure while absorbing the same subtle cues. As we retraced our route toward the main exit, the deviations became predictable, yet the impression of awareness lingered. A slight draft shifted against my face. A floorboard emitted a faint vibration beneath my boots. The light from our lamps shimmered along an uneven wall. None of it posed danger, yet the sum of these small interactions was undeniable. The watchers, the presence embedded in the tunnels, had not acted aggressively. They had only been patient, observing, responding. And now, as we moved toward the surface, they remained. We paused at the final junction before the exit. The corridor ahead stretched longer than mapped, its angle subtly altered. I adjusted my stride, placing each step carefully. The young technician mimicked the movement, instinctively matching the adjustment. The supervisor surveyed the junction, noting the subtle response without a word. Even the contractor, normally dismissive, moved more cautiously than the day before. The space had enforced its rhythm, and we had adapted. Emerging into daylight was anticlimactic yet charged with a new awareness. The forest beyond the tunnel mouth seemed ordinary at first. Sunlight on leaves, wind through branches, distant bird calls. Yet the memory of the tunnels lingered. I could feel the pattern of observation lingering in my own movements, the subtle feedback of awareness still echoing in my mind. The watchers had not followed in any literal sense, but the connection remained. Every measured step, every careful adjustment inside those tunnels had created a link I could not erase. I recorded the final measurements and observations outdoors, the young technician assisting without comment. The supervisor reviewed the notes, quietly acknowledging the anomalies and their implications without naming or interpreting them. The contractor packed up equipment with efficiency, clearly relieved to leave the tunnels. Yet even he could not deny the subtle imprint the space had left on his awareness. We were no longer simply surveyors of tunnels. We had become participants in their rhythm. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the tree line, knowing that below it lay corridors that had remembered our passage, deviations that had responded to our attention, and the silent, patient awareness of the watchers. There was no resolution, no revelation, no confrontation. The presence remained undefined, unchast, unnamed. And yet, I carry the experience forward, a quiet imprint on perception that would not fade. The mountains, the tunnels, the watchers, they had left a mark on the way I would walk, measure, and observe forever.